Highbridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Good Family Fitzgerald by Joseph de Prisco. Read by Paul Boehmer. The water is wide. I cannot get o'er, and neither have I wings to fly. Build me a boat that can carry two, and both shall row, my love and I. Could the truth be so simple, so terrible? Tim O'Brien, In the Lake of the Woods. Part 1. Chapter 1. Anthony and Francesca. Francesca never forgot the day Anthony, who was no fisherman, failed to bring home the fish. She did the math. Say the heart beats 80 times a minute, 4,800 times an hour, 115,000 times a day. That meant, in the 3 years since, the muscle that was her heart had contracted 126,150,000 times. The calculation was simple, if nothing else was. That was an incredible number, 126,150,000. To her, though, it felt more like one heartbeat ago. She couldn't wrap her mind around that number, either. Francesca resifted memories of what had seemed to be an ordinary day, the day her husband didn't return with the fish as he promised. Sparkling summer had mercifully descended after a pitiless winter. The fat heirloom tomatoes were ripening bright red in their raised beds. The prospect of a bountiful harvest. Honeybees zoomed, and hummingbirds darted, peony to sage to goldenrod, and beyond. She answered mail, returned calls, paid bills, did chores, ran errands, scheduled meetings, worked out, watered plants again, ate lunch. How genially purposeful was her routine. That was before everything changed for Anthony and for her, and for everybody she cared about. Memory is a funny thing, even if it isn't a thing, and there is nothing funny about it. So that was a lifetime, or a minute ago, a Thursday, typically the most vexed day of the week, not weighted with deferred obligation like a Monday or Tuesday, and not freighted with implied expectation like a Friday or Saturday, not hollow like a transitional Wednesday, or wistful and lonesome as a Sunday, either. Sundays could be particularly hard. That's when rain ought to fall, sunrise to midnight, or when owls should hoot and hoot and hoot some more. But back to Thursday. That's when you swivel backward and forward, when you are open to surprise, prepared for anything. But that is Thursday's reliably broken promise. Nobody's prepared when anything takes place. She had been the recipient of well-meaning, hopeless advice she should stay in the moment. That's the last place she wanted to be. All around her, people seemed to be manically meditating, too, when they weren't rushing off to spin classes and resistance training, or eating more plants and antioxidants and less animal protein. They were undivided, aggressively striving to stay in the moment. She half wished she could heed their counsel and stay in the freaking moment, if only she could fathom where and what and why the moment was. Their intentions were well-meaning, probably. And they made a sort of sense because consider the unappealing alternatives. Living in the foreclosed past meant trudging through the mucky sludge of regret and nostalgia, while living in the clouds of the inconceivable future meant taking up residence in the land of make-believe. And yet, loss and remembrance and the continually imploding present were the fundaments of her existence. On that Thursday, when Anthony did not return with the fish, dawn broke with uneasy intimations, sly premonitions. Francesca was already late for something urgent, but what that was, she could not name. She walked into the garden beyond her bedroom door in hopes that the scents of rosemary, basil, and freesia might elevate her spirits. Hopes were quickly dashed. The garden didn't help. Honestly, it never did. The night before, empty Wednesday night, she and Anthony had had an extraordinary spat, extraordinary in that they rarely tangled. They took no pleasure in marital swordplay, so it didn't take long before they both lost interest. Not that either was ADD. If anything, the two of them suffered from a surplus, not a deficit of attention. Thus it was, that awkward Thursday morning, she found herself stopping him dead in his tracks on his way out the door. "Not so fast, Buster. Not done with you yet." If she were not who she was, and he were not who he was, and they were not who they were, she might have been shouting, and the wedding china might have been rattling inside cabinets. The sentiments might have been accompanied by glassware flung, doors slammed, ultimatums delivered, and miserable zigzaggy lines of mascara running down her cheeks, but not a chance when it came to her, and him, and them. Her husband was bustling about, getting organized to go to work. The instant he heard "not so fast," deferential Buster, Anthony, that is, histrionically screeched to a halt. Roadrunner meep meets rock wall. Meep, Roadrunner. Just curious, meep, Anthony, darling. Go for it, Frankie. You're a smart guy.
Full disclosure, there was a cabinet-level consideration as to whether or not I ought to repeat second grade. Everybody knows second grade is a scholastic juggernaut.
She shook her head side to side, a miserable metronome. You sleep soundly, like you're an innocent man. How come when you wake up you're a knucklehead? Because about last night. A little snark and snip, a passing complaint, a minor grievance, an eye-roll, a self-defensive pushback. One glass of wine too many. All right, maybe two. And they drifted into their respective corners to lick their superficial wounds. But hours later they got through it and slept in each other's arms. Well, one of them slept. But no, marital triage was not on the docket, and as per usual, there wasn't a lot to clean up today. Knucklehead? You said knucklehead? What? You've never been told before? Objection, badgering, as well as hearsay. But let us stipulate semi-lovable. At the same time, kind of immaterial, too, he added. As well as leading, Your Honor. Calls for a conclusion. Exhibit A. Counsel is testifying and is way too foxy, especially with respect to the earliness of the hour. At this point, An outside observer would be hard-pressed to appreciate that Anthony was well-versed in raising logical and coherent and strategic objections in legal proceedings, unlike the frivolous, nonsensical ones he raised with Francesca. That's because, for his day job, he was a litigator specializing in criminal law. Lawyers are often justifiably saddled with a bad rep, but if you had a genuine problem and the money, Anthony Fitzgerald was the up-and-coming barrister you wanted to have your back. You didn't necessarily have to be Irish or to be personally acquainted with any of the Fitzgeralds, and you didn't always need to have all the cash for the retainer up front, but it didn't hurt. "Where you think you're going?" she asked. Not that she had suspicions. "Want to track me?" "Ankle monitor, never thought of that. You can borrow one from all your clients under house arrest." Then his forehead wrinkled, and his shoulders slumped, and his eyebrows arched, and his lower lip did that signature goofball overhang. That was his go-to Parisian street mime move, which was practically indistinguishable from his trademark dejected clown. She gave up, and smiled, and threw up her hands like somebody on the church steps, showering the bride and groom with confetti. What had they been fighting about? She could barely recall. Once more her vision was drawn to the shadowy mini-Zeus thunderbolt scar on his forehead, directly beneath the scalp line. It was a marker of Anthony's storied past, and it set off right on schedule a high-voltage, erotic charge. Such yearning made her woozy, as if she zip-lined from a great, great height. She braced herself, leaning a hip against the kitchen counter, arms folded. She was wearing gray sweats, her black mane of hair was tied back, and her reading glasses were perched on top of her head. To him, this made her resemble a college girl who had crammed all night for a final exam. In fact, her efforts at sleep had been sheet-twisting, pillow-punching, restless, and racked. Meanwhile, alongside her, he seemed to enjoy the serene slumber of the guilt-free. She had briefly entertained slapping him awake so they could resume talking, but in the end didn't follow through. That morning the big blue sky beckoned, and, dressed in a bespoke black suit and a gold marinella tie with contrasting orange la-di-da silk pocket square, he was going to work, as he usually did at this hour. Where else did she imagine he might be going? He stole a glance at the wall clock over her shoulder. He was on schedule. "You look snappy," she said. And he did. A while ago she had supervised his wardrobe makeover. He hadn't a clue how badly he required such intervention, which is one thing all men who desperately need a makeover have in common. He resisted at first, but soon his once-upon-a-time standard-issue corduroy sport coats and wrinkled chinos, which made him look like an assistant professor possessed of pronounced Marxist leanings, were relegated to St. Vincent de Paul, supplanted by a rack of Italian designer suits fashioned of sumptuous fabric whose folds embraced him in an elegant caress. When he risked a glance in the mirror, he wondered what mystifying road he had taken to become a guy wearing a suit like that. It was easy to map the path. He trusted Frankie's lead, and she never misguided him. Though, true, he would stipulate, for the record, early on she did buy him a pink shirt, which constituted a low point, but how could she have known then that his father would disown him if his son swanned around in such a fey garment? Francesca was inclined to be conciliatory. Her snappy was punctuated by a wry smile, as if she had made a poker hand, drawing to an inside straight. But honestly, no. She did not have one of those poker faces, at least when it came to him. Fighting was so dumb. She could shift direction quicker than one of those shimmering hummingbirds suspended outside her kitchen window. Pure Francesca Scalino. As for her last name, before she affirmed her Catholic wedding vows, she contemplated taking Anthony's, becoming Francesca Fitzgerald, which ethnic mashup would have qualified for major points on the mellifluousness scale. Maybe she had inhaled the dispersed current of pop feminism, or maybe she preferred her maiden name, not that there was anything wrong in her mind with becoming a Fitzgerald, or maybe professional considerations held sway, insofar as she had earned, during the boom, her successful entrepreneur's reputation as a Scalino. Her father did not enjoy a vote on the matter, though he expressed no displeasure when his precious daughter elected not to assume a new, and quintessentially Irish, last name. Keeping hers did not betoken ambivalence. She was not hedging her bets. She was not the type to hedge a bet or question her heart. Anthony was her soulmate and would be her husband, and she his devoted wife. Wasn't that obvious? As for him, the issue of a last name was more inconsequential than his defunct corduroy coats. He didn't care how her name appeared on the marriage certificate or mailbox, as long as the two of them were bonded in perpetuity. Anthony's parents may have been initially critical of what they construed to be the girl's radical decision to retain her name, but then again, they cultivated generalized skepticism with regard to the younger generation. There was no getting around that she was indeed Italian, and this would be what they would term, with pruned face and wrinkled mouth, a mixed marriage. So yes, definitely very old school. Yet their son proclaimed he was in love. That could be true, but what was he thinking? And with what was he thinking? An Italian girl? Well, that's what his mother wanted to know. Handsome boy like him, oldest of her 4 children, smart as a whip, setting such a poor example for the siblings, and, holy Jesus, child of Mary, what happened to that cute, curly-haired Colleen he was cavorting around with not so long ago, a girl who was gentle as a lamb and whose name she did not recall? Anthony didn't always remember her name either, and that former girlfriend's sweetness, which was authentic and abundant, cloyed over time. His baby sister was actually christened Colleen, but he was through cavorting around with any and all other Colleens, if that was the way to put it, because he had found the one and only. He didn't mount an argument or defend himself in the Fitzgerald court of family law because, what was the question again? Why couldn't they be happy for him? For him? That wasn't a rhetorical question. His father, whose temperament nobody would dare characterize as lamb-like, had not been half so wary as his mother. In fact, he cultivated a measure of grudging respect for those he spoke of as the Italians. In his specialized arena of business, dealings with them were hard to avoid. They proved competent businessmen, erratic and blustery, certainly, but finally bottom-line pragmatic, and prosperous, too, in all these respects, much like him. Not only that, he had in his garage an Italian trophy car, a gleaming, gorgeous, classic, low-slung Maserati. His wife refused on principle to ride in it, though what that principle was must have seemed so transparent that it had never been adduced. Driving the car was reserved for what was termed special occasions. But since few occasions were deemed sufficiently special, she hadn't many opportunities to spurn getting in. Not that that mattered. For her, the point remained. "Oh, you want me to buy an Irish car?" he once asked.
"Henry Ford's dam might have been Irish, but our kind don't have the corner on automobiles, and if we did, their pistons would be cantankerous as a tubercular deacon from Cork, and they'd all be slathered with seasick green paint."
That may be. But Anthony's mother ardently celebrated the bounty of Irish blood flowing in her unashamed veins.
In contrast, his father's feelings were muted, if not mixed, on that score.
Decades after that soul-crushing November 1963 day of national reckoning, President Kennedy's framed, fading photo still assumed a place of honor on their mantel, positioned alongside family portraits, all of them faithfully dusted. John Fitzgerald Kennedy, after all. You see? Then again, there was a time when it would have been borderline implausible to saunter into any Irish home or pub bereft of iconic images of the rascally handsome Jack and gravelly good-looking brother Bobby and, as she often implored the heavens, may they rest in peace, and let perpetual light shine upon them. Amen. One afternoon the engaged couple came over to the baronial family Fitzgerald home. Francesca and Anthony and his parents enjoyed a pleasurable lunch on the patio gazebo with the panoramic view of woods and water, and afterward Paddy offered Francesca what he and his son should have offered before, a tour of the grounds. In due course, the three of them ended up in the garage. He wanted to show off that classic car of his, and to signal, almost undoubtedly unconsciously, his open-mindedness on the budding Italian controversy. "Oh, my God!" she said, gasping. "A 1959 Maserati? Oh, my God! I would love to drive a car like this once in my life. Anthony, sweetheart, what's it like handling this beauty?" She extended her arms as if she were begging to be handed a newborn to swaddle. Following Francesca's lead, Sweetheart himself lifted up his own hands, in his case pleading for understanding from whatever deity existed above. He didn't know the first thing about handling this, or any other beauty, and less about cars, especially his dad's prized vehicle. He was never permitted behind the wheel of the bone-white two-seater the family reverentially referred to as the Maz. As a young boy, he may have been assigned numerous domestic chores to hone his sense of family obligation, but he wasn't ever allowed to wash, much less drive, the car. "There can't be many of these left in the world," she said to his father. "Where did you find this gem? A 3500 GT?
Knew a guy who knew a guy. Took one look, had to have it. It's almost as old as me, so we both needed work on the body and under the hood. I hear Maserati made a grand total of 18 of them.
Everybody raves about Ferrari, and they're obviously marvelous engineering works of art, but for my money, Maserati makes the most beautiful cars, and this one, it's so sleek and sexy. The automotive equivalent of, I don't know, a soaring raptor."
"You know your cars,"
said Paddy, beaming. She didn't really know her cars, and was normally unawed by anything on wheels, though she was invested in all matters Italian. She had evinced more exuberant interest in the Maz than Paddy's son ever had. The father didn't have the heart to tell his prospective daughter-in-law that his 3500 GT was not a 1959, but a 1957, an easy enough mistake to make, and it was christened an Italian name. He knew the name meant White Lady, but he would never risk pronouncing it and embarrassing himself with his wretched accent. The man had his faults, which were spectacular, and which his son could enumerate at length if compelled by a subpoena, but pedantry was not numbered among them. "A Maserati Dama Bianca. Unbelievable! What a showstopper!" she said.
"When I take it out, it loves to fly.
I got up to 120 a couple of times on the open road, and it roared so happy. My accountant regards this car as an investment, a terrible one. But I would never sell it, never, at any price. It must feel like a racehorse, a secretariat, affirmed, citation, Seattle slew, winning wire to wire. And now I find you also know your ponies. My dad, he spun some tales. He owned horses, trained them. More like a speculative interest. Paddy let this information seep in. How did he not put this together? Of course, this Scalino was the daughter of that Scalino, Mimo Scalino, who used to be the biggest and most reliable bookmaker around back when. He hadn't heard much about him lately, assuming that unless he'd gone over to the other side, he'd turned over a new leaf. He now had newfound respect for his own son's taste in judgment. It was not insignificant, either, that she had major means of her own, which were not derived from her own family business, and was, therefore, not likely to be tracking breadcrumbs on the trail to Fitzgerald riches. Overall, this girl might simply be too good to be true. Paddy's wife would come around to the proposed marriage. He would see to that, because Francesca's response to the car, not to mention her own family lineage, sealed the deal. He was enchanted. This dark-eyed, olive-skinned girl was a keeper, a woman who knew her way around classic automobiles, and the racetrack wouldn't get vertigo approaching the lightning-fast learning curve required by familiarity with the Fitzgeralds. He had the passing thought that the Maz would make for a sweet wedding present, but reconsidered. Perhaps a 10th wedding anniversary gift. Next time we'll take the venerable dame for a spin, Frankie. Fabulous, Mr. Fitzgerald. Please, dearie, please, Paddy. His teeth sparkled. Pass along respects to your dad from me, would you? Some day he and I can catch up. We all have much to celebrate. Anthony came this close to rubbing his eyes. He'd witnessed the man unleash his charm offensive on business partners, lawyers, school administrators, clergy, reporters, occasionally even law enforcement, on almost anybody. That is, not named Fitzgerald. Anthony had to admit the day had gone better than expected. In any case, Paddy Fitzgerald adopted the long view. As far as he was concerned, his son's brood would be perfect, and those Irish babies-to-be would be a shade Italian, true, but their last names at the baptismal font and in Catholic school would be Fitzgerald. So this was a small price to pay for what one day a grandfather presumed would be many, many grandchildren in need of being spoiled. Consider the immense bounty promised by their commingled genes. These babies would bring out the beautiful best of both families. Robin's egg-colored shirt highlighting your baby blues, she declared, that morning 3 years ago, taking stock of him as he was heading out the door. Got a hot date, Buster? Snappy. Hot date. Buster. Anthony had fallen forever for a woman who lifted her dialogue from broads straight out of central casting in the old black-and-white movies she fell asleep watching. That was where gents favored floppy fedoras and padded shoulders, and packed their gats in violin cases, and babes popped bubble-gum or chain-smoked a bluish haze, and had gams all the way up to here. As it happened, Anthony did have a date, a very hot court date alongside his client, the owner of Limerick Jewellery and Loan, under indictment for laundering cash to further an intricate criminal enterprise, whose intricacies were insufficiently intricate to misdirect the district attorney. Maybe all pawn shops traffic exclusively in used guitars and universally refrain from maintaining 2 sets of books. Maybe leprechauns also frolic in the woods.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?